and welcome back to Bookish Theories. In today's video, we'd like to talk about Tomorrow By Together's Japanese version of Zero by One Love Song, focusing on a little breakdown and analysis of the video to see how it is connected to the Chaos chapter as a whole. Now with Chaotic Wonderland, Tomorrow By Together have wrapped up the Chaos concept with the release of the Japanese version of Zero by One Love Song. As we'll see in a second, this is a more metaphorical video in comparison to its Korean counterpart, but the imagery that we see on screen is still very fitting with the story that they've been telling us up to this point. Much like the Chaos chapter as a whole, this version of Zero by One portrays the boys' downfall in a world of chaos where only you can save them with your light, but this time this idea is conveyed with them playing the role of fallen angels that crash in a world of loneliness and despair. Now right off the bat, this is very important because the fallen angel imagery connects us right back not only to the lyrics of Zero by One Love Song, but also to loser lover as well as angel or devil. You see, in the past, the boys introduced us to the idea that they had a duality in them. They could be angels who are innocent and pure, but also devils who rebel against the norm and do whatever they like. But over time, this concept evolved to portray the duality that all people actually have inside of themselves. The angel side, for instance, is the side of light, of youth, of innocence and dreams. This is a side that is best represented by the Magic Island, which is often portrayed as an heavenly place where the boys are safe and united no matter what is going on in their life. The devil side instead is essentially the darkness and negativity that the boys have to confront in the process of becoming an adult. It's the problems that they have, the despair that takes over them, as well as the inadequacy that they feel in a world that doesn't understand them, and this side is embodied by the pumas, by the monsters, as well as by chaos itself. In the past, we saw that when the devil side overwhelms them, it can be defeated by the light of the people that love them, and in Zero by One is no different, but in comparison to before, this time darkness is much harder to overcome. This is because as people grow, their problems grow with them, and as we saw in Loser Lover, the boys in the story have to face problems that in the past they never experienced before. They don't have money, they're stuck at dead-end jobs, and the people that should support them mistreat them instead. These are all problems that make them losers in this game of life, and the negativity that overcomes them slowly ruins the perception of the reality that surrounds them. You see, even if the world has the potential to be a beautiful place, their struggles make them lose sight of the light and just focus on the darkness, so their growing pains eventually lead them to alienate themselves from reality and escape in the world of their imagination. Now, their desire to escape here is not inherently bad, because every now and then finding comfort in a fantasy can help us cope with the reality that surrounds us. When people spend too much time in their imagination and forget to live, however, this positive distraction can become something that can make us lose ourselves in our own mind, and in Loser Lover, this point of no return was portrayed with them driving off a cliff in the attempt to fly once again to their Magic Island. You see, in contrast to what it might have seemed at first, this was not them trying to hurt themselves, but rather them trying to run away from a life that they didn't want. If we take a look at Taeyeon's cast, Loser Lover happens before the Korean Zero by One, so in the story the boys are pretty much alive, but their jump also overlaps with them losing themselves in their own mind and falling into chaos. Now, this idea is actually explained in the lyrics themselves, and as we see in a second, the lyrics are also essential to understand the story told in the Japanese Zero by One Love Song. You see, in Loser Lover, Yeonjun compared this desire to escape to a literal flight. In the lyrics, he told us that as they jumped from the highway, they spread their wings to fly to eternity, but these wings were broken, so their flight actually turned into a fall. In the moment, the boys think that this fall is beautiful because despite of the fear and the pain, this fall will also allow them to sink into their loved one's ocean. Since they are escaping reality to find refuge in their imagination, the boys find happiness in this downfall because even if they are falling into the abyss of chaos, this abyss is more comforting than the reality that they just left. If they lose themselves in their own mind, then they can be together for eternity, but in Zero by One Love Song, we discovered that this is not really the case. As we see in the Korean video, Yeonjun does indeed lose himself in his own mind. He makes up a whole adventure where he's with the others, even if in reality he's alone, but even if he welcomes this illusion, the truth of the matter is that he's actually dancing his way into the abyss. This is the real chaos here, because the actual definition of this word is none other than a black and infinite void. As Subin tells us, in this bottomless pit they cannot get into heaven because they don't belong there anymore. Since they're growing up, the heavenly world of fantasy that in the past was their refuge is being tainted by the darkness of the real world, and this is because when you become an adult you can never fully escape no matter how hard you actually try. If as an adult you try to escape in your imagination to avoid your problems, after a while you can lose yourself in your own delusion. You can be overcome by the very darkness that you were trying to escape and lose yourself in your own mind, and in the video this is exactly what is going on. As it was anticipated in Loser Lover, for instance, their descent into chaos begins with a fall that started off as a flight. Them trying to fly here can be seen as their attempt to reconnect with the metaphorical heaven that gave them comfort in the past, but since they're now growing up and losing that innocence, their wings are now too broken to fly. Despite of that, however, this fall is initially portrayed as something beautiful, and as it was explained in the press release, this contrast is meant to represent the alienation that the boys feel in losing themselves in their own mind. You see, in the story, the boys play the role of broken people. They are lonely, sad, lost, and as they experience their downfall, they are so focused on the prospect of flying away that they don't realize how beautiful the real world can actually be. When they crash into the world of chaos, all they see is trash and despair because they are so disconnected from reality that they don't see the potential beauty lingering in the background. As we see in Taeyeon's scene, for instance, at this stage of their life, the boys still have their wings. They're still holding on to that side of them and they're still trying to escape into their imagination, but as comforting as this might be, them holding on to that fantasy is paradoxically holding them back. You see, if we compare fantasy and reality, fantasy will always be better because in your imagination you can do whatever you want. This kind of freedom is impossible to obtain in real life, so until the boys hold on to that fantasy, reality will always look like hell. The more they try to run away from reality, the more alienated they get, and the more alienated they get, the more this contrast becomes evident. As we see in the video, each of the boys experience their own personal downfall because even if in the story they all have different problems, these problems are all a source of despair that makes them fall into chaos as they try to escape them. In Taeyeon's scene, for instance, we see that he's essentially stuck between two worlds. He still has wings that connect him to his childhood fantasy, but these wings are too broken to fly, so he's stuck in a reality that he perceives as lonely and sad. If you look closely, his scene is set in a classroom, but this classroom is abandoned. Everyone else has moved on, but he still holds on to those days that are now in the past, so his experience is very similar to that of a fallen angel longing for a paradise lost. Now, one interesting detail to point out here is that Taeyeon's downfall was also portrayed in Frost, and back then he fell from the world of his imagination despite him hanging on to it for as long as he could. Back then, his vision was also connected to crows, and these are animals that are symbols of transformation as well as mediators between life and death. In this context, however, the death that we are talking about is not a physical one, but rather the death of a stage of his life that in turn will lead him to the beginning of another. Taeyeon here is essentially shifting between childhood and adulthood, so the side of him that is dying is the side of innocence that is associated to his childhood dreams. Even if he still has wings, these wings are now too broken to fly, so he falls into a world of darkness while longing for a world of light, and the same concept is explored in Subin's scenes as well. After his fall, Subin looks up at the sky and sees an airplane flying by. This is the first indication that Subin longs to escape this world of pain, and the destination that he longs for is none other than the dream of paradise that he left behind. When he sings about him not being able to get into heaven, for instance, the environment that surrounds him essentially reflects his longing for the dream that he lost. Subin here is in a dump. He is a broken person surrounded by broken things, but instead of moving on, he stays in his misery because much like what we saw in Frost, he is still attached to the memory of a past that he cannot let go. As we see him in the dump, we also see that he is surrounded by withering flowers and that he is sitting in front of a curtain portraying a blue sky. That's an environment that looks very similar to the magic island of his fantasy, but the reality of it all is much more depressing and sad. Since he fell trying to fly, now he's in chaos. He's in a bottomless pit, lost in the illusion of a paradise where he no longer belongs to, so like Taeyeon, he's overcome by longing and despair. When it comes to Yunin Kai instead, we see that his downfall led him to a tub filled with plastic bottles, and once again this scene conveys the contrast between the fantasy that he longs for and the reality that he found himself in. If we compare these visuals to the pool scene of the Korean version, for instance, the comparison is very evident. In the paradise of his fantasy, he's with the others having fun in a pool full of water, but now that he has fallen, he is alone in a tub full of plastic. Much like Subin and Taeyeon, however, we see that Yunin Kai is unable to move on because as miserable as he is too lost in his own delusion to do anything about it. Once again, this is something that was also foreshadowed in Frost, because back then Kai ran after his angel's side despite it running away from him. Back then, Kai was still trying to hold on to the innocent side that was slipping away, and in 0 by 1 Love Song we see him lingering in his misery because he's still unable to let it go. When it comes to Bongyu, on the other hand, we see him lying on a bed in what seems to be a hospital. On his face, we see injuries that are very similar to the ones that he got back in Loser Lover, so his scene further reinforces the idea that what we see on screen is the aftermath of their flight at the end of that video. Much like the others, moreover, Bongyu is facing his personal hell by himself, but in his case, his loneliness actually recalls what we saw back in Drama. You see, back then, Bongyu played the role of an extra in his own life, but in his fantasy he was the protagonist of his story, and the people that he loved were there for him to love him back. In his imagination, the others took care of him, mended his injuries, and gave him all the attention that he craved. In both videos, however, we see that the reality of it all is much different because Bongyu is alone and nobody's there to support his healing. When it comes to Yeonjun instead, we see that his scene is set in a room where everything is packed and ready to go, so once again we get the sense that this is a moment of transition. He's moving away from his old life and going someplace else, and in the video this shift is portrayed with him waking up alone on his bed after dreaming of falling from the sky. Now the transition between him falling and him waking up here is actually very telling because this editing choice shows us that their downfall is not so much physical as it is psychological. In the story, the boys are not really falling from the sky, but they're falling inside of themselves as they move from one stage of life to the next. Even if all of them are going through it in different ways, however, one thing that they have in common is that they're all listening to music, and this is important because in this context, music is essentially the love song that is giving them comfort in this moment of struggle. If we take a look at the two versions of Chaotic Wonderland, for instance, the Zero version was them stuck in a frozen world, and the One version was them being together as a band. This means that what makes them one is literally music itself, and in the video this idea is conveyed with them using music as a way to reconnect with the fantasy that they shared. Until they listen to music, the boys can cope with the misery that surrounds them, but since they are in chaos, this escape is also the very thing that keeps them from understanding how far they've actually fallen. This, however, changes when the music stops, because when this happens, the boys finally look up at the sky and they realize what is actually going on around them. From the moment the music stops, we see that the boys fall into complete desperation. They scream, they are in pain, they fall into despair, and this is because now they are completely disconnected from one another. If until that moment the boys were alone but could reconnect through the love song that made them one, when the music stops, this illusion disappears, so they have to deal with the terrible reality that so far they try to escape. Now throughout the video we see that their downfall is also accompanied by comets falling from the sky, and these visuals can actually be interpreted in different ways. One possible explanation, for instance, is that the comets might actually be a callback to Your Name, which is a Japanese animation about two people who are connected by the red thread of fate and swap bodies in order to avoid a tragic cosmic event. While in 0 by 1 the boys don't swap bodies with each other, they're still going through the very same downfall, so their experiences are essentially interchangeable. On top of that, like the characters, the boys are connected by fate. If in the video this connection is represented by the headphones that they use to listen to the music that unites them, in Chaotic Wonderland this concept is also explored with Ito, which is a song that is literally about the red string of fate that is also mentioned in Your Name. In the video, however, this connection is lost when the music stops, so it's no surprise that they fall into despair, because them losing each other essentially means that they're doomed to their misery. Because of that, this apocalyptic event can also be seen as a metaphor for the ending of their own world. It's a doom's night that separates them, that destroys the dream of youth that kept them going, and that forces them to face a reality where the darkness lingers but the lights are falling. As tragic as this might seem, however, it's also important to point out that the boys' story is a story divided into cycles, so the ending of something also overlaps with the beginning of something else. Even more importantly, in the Star Seekers, the boys are stuck in a time loop, so while in the setting of the video there seems to be no happy ending, this is only one possible outcome of a story that has many. By the end, moreover, we also see some clues that might actually foreshadow that this is far from the end of the world, because the comets that we see in the sky can also have a positive meaning as well. You see, on a metaphorical level, a meteor shower actually symbolizes beauty rising from the ashes. When applied to a spiritual journey like the one that the boys are facing here, these visuals represent a new wisdom that is gained after facing the shadow that you have inside of yourself. Now this is very relevant in this context because in the video the comets accompany the boys' descent into their own chaos. They experienced a spiritual death, confronted their own darkness and fell into despair, but when you hit rock bottom the only way to go is up, so these comets might actually foreshadow a rebirth. After going through so much pain, this pain will give rise to something beautiful, and this idea might also be confirmed by the final scene, where Taeyeon disappears with his wings, leaving his clothes behind. Now these visuals here actually hint at the fact that Taeyeon was finally able to move on. He got rid of what held him back and managed to transcend his chaos and fly away, and if this is the case, then this concept might actually clue us in on the possible theme of the next comeback. You see, up until now, one major aspect of the story was the boys being helpless. Every time the darkness took over them, they were always waiting for others to save them, and this is a concept that stayed consistent ever since their debut. In Napova Star, Kai saved Yeonjun, in The Doom's Night, Subin saved all of them, in Can't You See Me they asked to be saved, and in 0 by 1 Love Song you saved them from the cold. Up to this point, the boys always relied on others to save them, but if this time they were able to do it themselves, this might imply that in the next chapter they will explore the importance of saving themselves and knowing themselves in this new stage of their life. If you look closely, part of their journey to adulthood was always trying to understand who they were, but whether they were losers or lovers or angels or devils, who they were was always described in relation to the outside world. They were angels for each other, devils for the others, losers for society, and lovers for their loved ones, but now it might be time to understand that at the end of the day, they are just themselves. This idea might also be hinted by the fact that in their latest content, the focus is on the word me as opposed to you. The focus on the me here might finally allow the boys to answer the question, who am I? Not in relation to the world, not in relation to you, but in relation to themselves. This could be the next topic of Minisode 2 or even the next chapter of their story, but to know how things will play out, we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please think about liking and subscribing. As always, thank you so much for watching guys. I'll see you next time. Bye bye!